Good evening. The joy of involvement. Despite the growing appreciation of details in news stories, the usefulness of telling details in everyday conversation is not universally recognized. A woman told me that members of her family referred to her grandmother in a phrase that typifies the old woman's conversation. I had a little ham. I had a little cheese. This affectionate yet disparaging mode of reference reveals that they find it boring when grandmother tells them what she had for lunch. They wish she would give fewer details or not report her lunch at all. My great aunt, for many years a widow, had a love affair when she was in her 70s. Obese, balding, her hands and legs misshapen by arthritis, she did not fit the stereotype of a woman romantically loved, but she was, by a man, also in his 70s, who lived in a nursing home, but occasionally spent weekends with her in her apartment. In trying to tell me what this relationship meant to her, my great aunt told of a conversation. One evening, she had, okay, wait a second. One evening, she had had dinner out with friends. When she returned home, her male friend called, and she told him about the dinner. He listened with interest and asked her, "What did you wear?" When she told me this, she began to cry. Do you know how many years it's been since anyone asked me what I wore? When my great aunt said this, she was saying that it had been years since anyone had cared deeply, intimately about her. The exchange of relatively insignificant details about daily life sends a meta message of rapport and caring. Attention to details associated with a person is often a sign of romantic interest. In a novel titled The Jealous One by Celia Fremlin, a woman sends her husband Joffrey next door to deliver a dinner invitation to their new neighbor, who has moved in that day. Joffrey returns full of excitement, bubbling with admiration for and details about the new neighbor. He announces, starry-eyed, that the neighbor has invited them to dinner in her not yet furnished home, and he asks his wife if she has a red ribbon for Shang-Lo, the neighbor's Pekingese, explaining that Shang-Lo is the opposite of Shanghai. The wife responds with irony, but Joffrey is slow to join in her ironic denigration of the neighbor's airs in ribboning her dog. Okay, here's a little writing about that. She giggled in terrible solitude for a fraction of a second, and then Joffrey joined in, a tiny bit too late and a tiny bit too loud, and the joke did not lead to another joke. Murmuring something about having promised, Joffrey hurried away out of the kitchen and out of the house without any red ribbon. And this piece of red ribbon, which they didn't look for, didn't find, and probably hadn't got, became the very first of the objects which couldn't ever again be mentioned between them. Joffrey's romantic interest in the new neighbor leaks out in his enthusiastic, uncritical recounting of details about her, such as the breed and name of her dog. Joffrey's romantic interest in the new neighbor leaks out. Oh, that's the same part. If recalling a detail or name is a sign of caring, failure to recall a name can be seen as a sign of lack of caring. Complaints are frequent from people whose parents disapprove of their partners or friends and seem to display their disapproval subtly by habitually referring to them by the wrong names or failing to recall their names. The same phenomenon can be manipulated for positive ends. This was the case with a woman who remained friends with the wife of an acquaintance of her former husband's. Her friend persisted in referring to the former husband's new wife as, "What's her name?" The divorced woman took the meta message of this to be, "Even though I see her occasionally, I don't really care about her. You are still the one who counts to me." Not remembering the new wife's name was offered as evidence of lack of caring about her and consequently loyalty to the first wife. Paying attention to details of a person's appearance can be a means of flirting. A woman had an appointment to meet a man she had met only once before briefly. They were both married. The purpose of the meeting was business, but the man began their conversation by observing that she looked younger than he recalled, and her hair was different. "You were wearing a hat then, weren't you?" he said. "And you were dressed in white then, too." Simply saying that he had noticed her appearance the first time they had met was a kind of flirtation. It was not a displeasing one to her, though her husband found it displeasing when she recounted it to him. The noticing the noticing of details shows caring and creates involvement. Men, however, often find women's involvement in details irritating because women are concerned first and foremost with establishing intimacy. They value the telling of details. Conversely, many women complain that men don't tell enough details. A woman thus frustrated is Laura in Alice Madison's story, Sleeping Giant. Laura and Dan are both troubled by their son-in-law's plan to buy an old, run-down house. In the past, when Laura tried to talk to her daughter about it, the daughter defended her husband. But Dan now assures Laura that their daughter sees her point of view because she said as much to him. "Believe me," he says, "she is not happy about this." Laura wants more details about the conversation, but Dan won't supply them. Here's what Laura asks. "Well, why doesn't she tell him so?" He doesn't answer. "What did she say exactly?" Laura is searching in her canvas bag for her car keys. She's chilly after all, and there's a flannel shirt in the trunk of her car. She waits, holding the keys and the bag, but Dan still doesn't answer, and she drops the bag on the bench. "What did she say?" "Oh, I don't remember. General things." "What did you say?" "Oh, I don't know, Laura." Laura turns aside, abruptly opens the trunk, and stares into it for a moment, annoyed that Dan will not tell her more. Laura sounds like innumerable flesh and blood women I've talked to. As one put it, men don't tell the whole story. Who said what? Another complained of her husband. "It's like pulling teeth to get him to tell me. What did she say? What did he say?" Yet another woman recalled a time that her best friend's husband tried unsuccessfully to take part in one of their conversations. Breaking with tradition, he tried to tell about an experience that he thought was similar to the ones they were discussing. The two women plied him with questions he couldn't answer about exactly what had been said and how and why. He backed off from the story and didn't try to tell any more. Perhaps he was wondering to himself why the women were interested in all these unimportant details. All right, the next part. Skip the details. Though many women value the recounting of subtle nuances in conversations with close friends, there are situations in which everyone feels oppressed by being told or asked for what seem like too many details. If interest in details is a sign of intimacy, a woman will resist such interest if it comes from someone she doesn't want to be intimate with. And everyone has had the experience of being told unwanted details, so many that they seem pointless or demand longer or more intimate attention than one wants to give. Many of the examples I have collected of people piling on details in conversation involve old people. This may be because old people often want more involvement with young people than young people want with them, or because old people frequently cannot hear well, so they tell detailed stories to maintain interaction. Old people are also more inclined to reminisce about the past, consequently telling stories that are likely to include details. It is a tenet of contemporary American psychology that mental health requires psychological separation from one's parents. One way of resisting over-involvement, for some people at least, is resisting telling details. For example, one woman told me that her mother sought over-involvement with her and had succeeded in achieving over-involvement with her sister, Jane. To support her claim, she said, "It's amazing the details of Jane's life my mother knows." Later, she was explaining how she resists her mother's attempts to get overly involved in her life. As an example of her mother's prying, she said, "She is hungry for details. If I tell her I went somewhere, she asks, 'What did you wear?'" The question that offended this woman was the same one that had brought my great aunt such happiness. The difference is that my great aunt was seeking involvement with the man who asked her what she wore. This woman was resisting what she perceived as the excessive involvement her mother sought with her. Presumably, however, when her sister Jane talks to their mother, she does not feel that the question, "What did you wear?" is inappropriate. Perhaps, like my great aunt, Jane values the show of caring and resulting involvement. In the next section, mixing business with gossip. Many women mix talk about relatively important things, like business, with talk about relatively unimportant things, like clothes. On Monday morning, Marjorie walks into Beatrice's office to ask her opinion about a contract after they have settled their business, or perhaps before they bring each other up to date on their personal lives. Marjorie has her hands full with her ailing mother-in-law. Beatrice is feeling optimistic about a new relationship. A woman who runs a counseling center noted that when she meets with women on her staff, it is not unusual for them to spend 75% of the time in personal talk and then efficiently take care of business in the remaining 25%. To men on the staff, this seems like wasting time, but the director places value on creating a warm, intimate working environment. She feels that such personal talk contributes to a sense of rapport that makes the women on her staff happy in their jobs and lays a foundation for the working relationship that enables them to conduct business so efficiently. The mutual knowledge and trust that grows out of personal talk can precede a business relationship as well as grow out of it. A magazine article described a partnership between two women who own a construction company. The seed of their working relationship had been planted years before the business was founded, when the two women met regularly to exchange coffee and talk. When one of them decided to start a business, her working relationship with her partner was already in place. For women who engage in frequent, regular social talk with friends, the machinery is up and running when a significant decision needs to be made. Elizabeth Loftus, psychologist specializing in eyewitness testimony, was confronted with a moral dilemma when she was asked to testify on behalf of the man accused of being Ivan the Terrible, a notoriously sadistic Nazi war criminal. To be consistent, Loftus felt she should testify in this case, as she had in many others, but her relatives and friends argued against it, and she recoiled at the prospect of undermining the testimony of the few witnesses who were alive to tell what Ivan had done. A mere 50 survivors of an estimated 1 million of Ivan's victims. The dilemma was resolved when a friend dropped by for tea. Loftus recalls, "My friend, quoting Emerson, reminded me that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." With this comfort, Loftus decided not to testify. If women and men have different habits for social talk, they also make different use of it. Differences in uses of social talk also begin early. One couple I talked to had different perspectives on their son's relationship with his best friend. The mother thought it odd that despite the significant amount of time the boys spent together, for example, playing football, their son found out what college his best friend, for example, playing football. Their son found out what college his best friend was going to by reading it in their yearbook. One day, a girl called him to ask whether his friend had a date for the prom. She was calling for her friend, who wanted to ask his friend, but not if he already had a date. Not only did their son not know whether his best friend had a date for the prom, but he was annoyed that the girl thought he should know. He gave her his friend's phone number and suggested she call to find out directly. He later commented that he had known his friend was going to the prom. He might have planned to go himself. Not keeping up with such personal information deprived him of a chance to go. All of this seemed very strange to the boy's mother, who could not imagine what it meant to be best friends if it didn't include knowing the basic developments in the other's life. To the boy's father, however, it seemed unremarkable. And the next one, talking about versus talking against. The relatively positive or negative value that is placed on talking about personal details of one's life or others is reflected in the positive and negative views of gossip. One man commented that he and I seem to have different definitions of gossip. He said, "To you it seems to be discussion of personal details about people known to the conversationalist. To me it's a discussion of the weaknesses, character flaws, and failures of third persons, so that the participants in the conversation can feel superior to them. This seems unworthy, hence gossip is bad. You're welcome. That was my man voice. Or one of them. I have a few. This man's view parallels that of a woman who told me she was troubled by one of the women in her child care co-op who gossiped too much. But it turned out that this woman's gossip was all negative, putting down other members of the co-op and criticizing them. It was not the talking about that was disturbing, but the talking against. This distances the speakers from those they are talking about, rather than bringing them closer. Furthermore, it is natural to assume that someone who has only negative things to say about others will also say negative things about you when you aren't there. Push a little light out of there. Gossip, as talking against, is related to a verbal game that Christine Chepin calls scapegoat. Oh, I know a lot about this game. In conversations she analyzed, Chepin found that speakers talked against someone who wasn't there to redress imbalances of power that had erupted. Scapegoat was a way for speakers to achieve parity with each other by teaming up against someone else. In Chepin's examples, however, the third party whom the conversationalists team up against wasn't just anyone. It was their boss. And this brings us back to the view of the man who told me why he considers gossip to be bad. To the extent that talking about someone who is not there brings an absent party into the room, the effect is to establish connection. But if that party is brought into the room to be put down, then the effect is negotiation of status. As always, connection and status are operating at once, so both views are valid. They are different takes on the same scene. And the next one. Women and men on their own terms. What is the solution then? If women and men are talking at cross purposes about gossip as about other matters? How are we to open lines of communication? The answer is for both men and women to try to take each other on their own terms, rather than applying the standards of one group to the behavior of the other. This is not a natural thing to do, because we tend to look for a single, right way of doing things. Understandably, experts are as liable to do this as anyone else. A national audience participation talk show featured a psychologist answering questions about couples' relationships. A woman in the audience voiced a complaint. My husband talks to his mother, but he won't talk to me. If I want to know how his day was, I listen to his conversation with his mother. The psychologist told this woman he probably trusts his mother more than he trusts you. This comment reinforced the woman's own suspicions, and her worst fears. And what the psychologist said was perfectly legitimate and reasonable within the framework of talk in women's friendships. The friend to whom you talk daily, telling all the little experiences you had, is your best friend. But how reasonable an interpretation is it from the man's point of view? I would wager that her husband did not think he needed to do anything special to create intimacy with his wife, because he was with her every day. But because his mother was alone, He humored her by telling her unimportant little things that she seemed to want to hear. His mother's need to hear such details would make sense to her son because she was alone and needed him there as a substitute for the real thing. Wait. His mother's need to hear such details would make sense to her son because she was alone and needed them as a substitute for the real thing, like watching life from her window. He wouldn't understand why his wife would want and need to hear such talk. Although it is possible that this man trusts his mother more than his wife, the evidence given does not warrant such a conclusion. The therapist was judging the man's way of talking by women's standards. In a sense, the value of therapy are those more typically associated with women's ways of talking than with men's. This may be why a study showed that among inexperienced therapists, women do better than men. But over time, with experience, this gender difference disappears. Eventually, perhaps, men therapists and men in therapy learn to talk like women. This is all to the good. Assertiveness training, on the other hand, teaches women to talk more like men. And this, too, is to the good. Women and men would both do well to learn strategies more typically used by members of the other group, not to switch over entirely, but to have more strategies at their disposal. Habitual ways of talking are hard to change. Learning to respect others' way of talking may be a bit easier. Men could accept that many women regard exchanging details about personal lives as a basic ingredient of intimacy, and women should accept that many men do not share this view. Mutual acceptance will at least prevent the pain of being told you are doing something wrong when you are only doing things your way. We got a smidge of light here. I'm going to read on a little further. Chapter 5. I'll explain it to you. And this one is titled Lecturing. Titled. My mouth is tired. Okay. Lecturing and listening. Couple of my favorite things. At a reception following the publication of one of my books, I noticed a publicist listening attentively to the producer of a popular radio show. He was telling her how the studio had come to be built where it was and why he would have preferred another site. What caught my attention was the length of time he was speaking while she was listening. He was delivering a monologue that could only be called a lecture, giving her detailed information about the radio reception at the two sites, the architecture of the station, and so on. I later asked the publicist if she had been interested in the information the producer had given her. "Oh, yes," she answered. But then she thought a moment and said, "Well, maybe he did go on a bit." The next day she told me, "I was thinking about what you asked. I couldn't have cared less about what he was saying. It's just that I'm so used to listening to men go on about things I don't care much about. I didn't even realize how bored I was until you made me think about it." I was chatting with a man I had just met at a party. In our conversation, it emerged that he had been posted in Greece with the RAF during 1944 and 1945. Since I had lived in Greece for several years, I asked him about his experiences. What had Greece been like then? How had the Greek villagers treated the British soldiers? What had it been like to be a British soldier in wartime Greece? I also offered information about how Greece had changed, what it is like now. He did not pick up on my remarks about contemporary Greece, and his replies to my questions quickly changed from accounts of his own experiences, which I found riveting, to facts about Greek history, which interested me in principle, but in the actual telling left me profoundly bored. The more impersonal his talk became, the more I felt oppressed by it, pinned involuntarily in the listener position. At a showing of Judy Chicago's jointly created artwork, The Dinner Party, I was struck by a couple standing in front of one of the displays. The man was earnestly explaining to the woman the meaning of symbols in the tapestry before them, pointing as he spoke. I might not have noticed this unremarkable scene, except that The Dinner Party was radically feminist in conception, intended to reflect women's experiences and sensibilities. While taking a walk in my neighborhood on an early summer evening at twilight, I stopped to chat with a neighbor who was walking his dogs. As we stood, I noticed that the large, expansive yard in front of which we were standing was aglitter with the intermittent flickering of fireflies. I called attention to the sight, remarking on how magical it looked. "It's like the 4th of July," I said. He agreed, and then told me he had read that the lights of fireflies are mating signals. He then explained to me details of how these signals work. For example, groups of fireflies fly at different elevations and could be seen to cluster in different parts of the yard. In all these examples, the men had information to impart, and they were imparting it. On the surface, there is nothing surprising or strange about that. What is strange is that there are so many situations in which men have factual information requiring lengthy explanations to impart to women, and so few in which women have comparable information to impart to men. The changing times have altered many aspects of relations between women and men. Now it is unlikely, or at least in many circles, for a man to say, "I am better than you because I am a man and you are a woman." But women who do not find men making such statements are nonetheless often frustrated in their dealings with them. One situation that frustrates many women is a conversation that has mysteriously turned into a lecture, with the man delivering the lecture to the woman, who has become an appreciative audience. Once again, the alignment in which women and men find themselves arrayed is asymmetrical. The lecturer is framed as superior in status and expertise, cast in the role of teacher, and the listener is cast in the role of student. If women and men took turns giving and receiving lectures, there would be nothing disturbing about it. What is disturbing is the imbalance. Women and men fall into this unequal pattern so often because of the differences in their interactional habits. Since women seek to build rapport, they are inclined to play down their expertise rather than display it. Since men value the position of center stage and the feeling of knowing more, they seek opportunities to gather and disseminate factual information. If men often seem to hold forth because they have the expertise, women are often frustrated and surprised to find that when they have the expertise, they don't necessarily get the floor. It's getting pretty dark. I'm going to read this last one. First me, then me. I guess just a little bit more light. There we go. First me, then me. I was at a dinner with faculty members from other departments in my university. To my right was a woman. As the dinner began, we introduced ourselves. After we told each other what department we were in and what subjects we taught, she asked what my research was about. We talked about my research for a little while. Then I asked her about her research, and she told me about it. Finally, we discussed the ways that our research overlapped. Later, as tends to happen at dinners, we branched out to others at the table. I asked a man across the table from me what department he was in and what he did. During the next half hour, I learned a lot about his job, his research, and his background. Shortly before the dinner ended, there was a lull, and he asked me what I did. When I said I was a linguist, he became excited and told me about a research project he had conducted that was related to neurolinguistics. He was still telling me about his research when we all got up to leave the table. This man and woman were my colleagues in academia. What happens when I talk to people at parties and social events, not fellow researchers? My experience is that if I mention the kind of work I do to women, they usually ask me about it. When I tell them about conversational style or gender differences, they offer their own expertise. They offer their own experience to support the patterns I describe. This is very pleasant for me. It puts me at center stage without my having to grab the spotlight myself, and I frequently gather anecdotes I can use in the future. But when I announce my line of work to men, many give me a lecture on language, for example, about how people, especially teenagers, misuse language nowadays. Others challenge me, for example, questioning me about my research methods. Many others change the subject to something they know more about. Of course, not all men respond in this way, but over the years I have encountered many men and very few women who do. It is not that speaking in this way is the male way of doing things, but that it is a male way. There are women who adopt such styles, but they are perceived as speaking like men. All right, we have gotten too dark for even me, but we are whipping through this book. I appreciate you. Good night. Thank you for being with me.